Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is usually known as SANHS. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm a trustee for SANHS. This evening, Dr. Oliver Kent will be giving a talk on how China came to Wales. Oliver is a ceramic historian and potter. Until his recent retirement, he was the course leader for the Applied Arts course in Bristol. He's taught ceramics and archaeology at Bristol, Staffordshire and Bath Spa universities and is a trustee of the Stradling Collection of Design in Bristol. Particular areas of research include the early technology of ceramic firing, post-medieval pottery in archaeology and the history of design in Bristol. Between 1981 and 2010, he and David Dawson ran the Bickley Ceramics project in Somerset. The project explored medieval and early modern kiln technology and led to many publications, including a definitive study on 15th century pottery kilns. As a maker, he is best known for his hand-built teapots and has been selected twice to build and fire kilns at the International Ceramics Festival in Aberystwyth. As usual, Oliver will take questions at the end of the talk. To ask questions, you'll need to activate the chat button at the bottom of the page and type in a question. To find the button, just run the mouse over the bottom of your screen and a series of buttons should pop up. If the button's not there, it might be at the top right or even hidden under 3 dots. Because we're recording this lecture, we won't use names in the question time. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £5 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be greatly appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation China. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to Oliver.
Thank you, Lizzie. Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Oliver Kent. I'm going to swap myself over to my PowerPoint and launch into telling you all about these amazing pots from, lost my place, momentary clicking thing. Right, okay, go. I'm here tonight to tell you something about the quite extraordinary cache of Chinese export porcelain, which was found during building work at the rear of the Wells and Mendip Museum. The Chinese porcelain is part of a huge group of pottery, which appears to represent the ceramic contents of the house in around about 1820. The building, as you see it, is in its core is a medieval building, but in the 1820s it was given a really substantial makeover to resulting in the way that it appears now as an early 19th century house with sort of Tudor Gothic features. For instance, the oriel window over on the left-hand wing. The right-hand side of the house has been substantially demolished and rebuilt at that time. When Wells and Mendip Museum decided that they needed to build an extension towards the rear to make a museum store and a public lecture space, they decided to do in the mid-90s, they decided to do their own archaeology. There were some small outbuildings at the back, and the new building, the new building was to extend backwards down the left-hand side of the garden. What appeared was the archaeology of the later house. We've got rather splendid cobbled yard here, which is now been exposed as part of the present garden, and the remains of earlier outbuildings at the back here. In the shadows at the back, down underneath the tree, right to the rear left, was a cellar, which presumably was underneath the outbuildings, whose roof had partly survived, you see in the smaller photograph. And the builders had tipped rubble into it to fill it, and something in the region of 750 pieces of ceramic. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. It's probably more than that. every kind of pot you can think of, from the basic domestic objects, coarse redwares, plant pots, right through to the kind of luxury items, Chinese porcelain and so on, tipped in pell-mell. Piles of plates look as if they've just been dropped over the side. Apparently there's a bit of a trail of potsherds in that direction, as if people were throwing things out the kitchen window and burying them down the garden to put them in there. Most of those objects, a vast proportion of the sherds are still there, are there. We just go on to this little film, just gives an impression of the space. This is the new building at the rear of the house. The pit is just under the right-hand end of that new building, and you can see the rear of the house with its various, it's rather more layered at the back than it is from the front. And then Wells Cathedral with delightful chiming bells in the background. Doing its thing, yep. So what was in there? Well, there were about somewhere in the region of 750 pots. Within that is this collection of Chinese porcelain, for which is what I'm talking about now. So we've sorted it out from the rest and simply dealing with this. There are altogether just over 1,600 sherds, bits of pot, weighing 18.5 kilos. That's a lot of stuff. The minimum number of vessels is around about 180, which is of which around about 75 to 80 are substantially complete, like the early 18th century saucer. There's lovely Kangxi saucer. There are a pair of those. Quite a lot of the things come in groups and sets. What's curious about the groups as a whole is that although the documentary history makes it clear that this stuff is being thrown away around about 1820, that the range of types spans from the late 17th century right through to just before 1800. There's nothing 19th century, and there are a few pieces that are older, earlier 17th century. So it's a huge range, and that's across all of the material, not just the porcelain. So it makes quite an exciting cross-section of 18th century ceramics, but also, particularly in terms of Chinese ceramics, the sort of thing that's available in Wells at that date. As a country town, how far are these things penetrating? So if we consider how these things get here, the importation of porcelain in the 17th century, most porcelain that's finding its way here is finding its way in small quantities, sometimes through piracy, Portuguese ships being raided by pirates who then capturing things. There's archaeologically, porcelain turns up in the southwest earlier than it does in other parts of the country, partly probably for that reason. It's coming into places like Portsmouth or Exeter as sort of stolen cargo, if you like, rather than being formally imported. By the end of the 17th century, there's a real interest in establishing a long-distance trade to the Far East. And in the very early 1700s, the East India Company is set up, and a formal trade is established between Canton, China, and India halfway, and back to London. Starts up very slowly, small numbers of ships, and builds up gradually. The East India Company don't own the ships. They get other people to, you invest in a ship, you invest in cargo. The East India Company's primary interest is tea. That's the trade, that's where the profit is. Porcelain is always a secondary trade to that. You'll bring that, you need the cups to put the tea in, so to speak, and the exotic sells well. But when you look at the documentary history of the East India Company, the margin on porcelain is always quite small. The profit is in the tea. Porcelain is used often as the heavy cargo at the bottom of the ship, with the light tea higher up. So they're using it as ballast as well as a product to sell. It's rather nice that the Taunton, in Taunton, at the Somerset Museum, they have this lovely painting of the East Indiaman, the Taunton Castle, which was owned by a group of Taunton businessmen, hence the name, and ran the trade, operated between 1791 and 1812. It's a bit late for what we're actually looking at in terms of pots, but it's nice to have a local East Indiaman. Early in the early period, there were infrequent voyages, small amounts coming in, and it's expensive stuff. If we look at the next slide, and this is what we're presented with from the cellar. This is the main complete pieces from the early 18th century, spread out on my old dinner table just to present them. Give you an idea of the completeness of some of these things. This range of mainly dinnerware. There are also some teacups and things to go with these, but all of these dating to that period between, say, 1680, 1720, 1730, something like that. This would be coming in small quantities. It would be coming into London. The East India Company held auctions. They'd empty the ship out and then auction the contents. London dealers primarily would buy the stuff and then redistribute it. They would sell direct to customers, but they would operate a wholesale trade. But at this stage, it would be quite small scale. So this stuff is kind of quite relatively uncommon, if you like. I'll go into more detail in a minute. I just want to run through the kind of thread of things. Sorting through the pots, I found it was easier to break them down to three groups. Those early things, stuff that belonged in the middle of the 18th century and stuff that belonged towards the end. So this lot are in the process of sorting through the body of complete or semi-complete vessels from the mid-century. So we're talking the 1750s, 60s, 70s, where there's quite a contrast. These are almost all teacups and saucers. At the back of the shelf there, you can see slop bowls for putting your slops in when you're finished with your tea. In the foreground, there's what's called a saucer dish, a wide, shallow dish, which would be used for serving bread and butter or biscuits or whatever alongside your tea on your polite tea table. And there's the tea service that goes with that had gone in to the pit complete. So down the boxes below, we'll see it later as the rest of the tea service. Not many dinner plates. The quality of some, whereas those early pieces are quite high quality, these are in some cases quite chunky and coarse, and there's a definite change in the look of the things. As I say, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. The third group are the things from the later 18th century, and something different has happened completely now. I think it's very evident from that laid out on a dining table. These are dining wares, they're in sets. These are components probably from 3 dinner services. The big ashets, meat plates, 2 complete ones there and half of one. The collection includes pieces of more. They often came in various sort of size graded sets of 6 or 8 or 10 sets of dinner plates. And then the teawares on the outside the table there, those are all a matching set as well, or they're sort of muddled matching set. Jugs, teacups, saucers, and basins and things, and some decorative pieces in there. But this stuff is very much, we're now talking about things that look very much like the kind of thing that you might get from Staffordshire. In effect, they're very, very European looking, with the kind of Chinese decoration that we want the Chinese to produce, I guess. My absolute favourite, incidentally, is the design in the middle, the large ashet, which has the cormorant who's on my first slide diving off one of the bushes into the water. Lovely thing. He looks like he's about to spear the cormorant below him. So if we go on from those, so to look at them in a bit more detail, to give an idea of what's there. This is the earliest of the pots and the odd one out. There are a few other sherds that might have something to do with this, but this one, this double gourd vase is probably Kangxi date, sort of later 17th century. They're difficult to date. It could be even earlier. It's been broken and glued. You can see particularly on the left-hand photo a black line running across it. Our conservator who looked at that said that's very ancient glue. Somebody's knocked it in half 300 years ago and glued it back together again. So the decision was not to interfere with it from a conservation point of view, because that was part of its history. It's had adventures and people have rescued it a number of times. These are very popular forms in China, as much as for export. This one has this tulip motif on the upper part of it, which kind of comes from the Middle East. It's part of that kind of international nature of Chinese porcelain design. The chap sitting holding a piece of paper and leaning on a cushion there is a guy called Wang Shizi, and the person walking towards him on the other side of the vase is his son, who, if you can make it out, is carrying a bird, carrying a goose. Wang Shizi was a 4th century calligrapher, and in China, he's one of a number of calligraphers who are regarded as the greats. And he's quite a popular motif on Chinese ceramics. And it's something you see on this earlier material where, although the Chinese are making things for export, they're often using motifs at this sort of date, which are the motifs they're interested in, and they hope we're interested in the West. They're not making things directly for a Western market. It's kind of a hybrid pot, but nonetheless, he's a popular Chinese figure. This is a 13th century painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's actually part detail from it. And this is Wang Shizi out drawing. He's sketching. There are some geese on the pond there. His son is in attendance in the background, and he's got a sketchbook out and he's drawing geese. He was particularly taken with the ripples as they swam. The reference on the pot is to the family keeping geese so he could draw them. He had pet geese to draw. So this is the group as a whole is primarily tablewares, kitchenwares, not kitchenwares, yes, tablewares, teawares, functional ceramics. Sorry, telephone going off in the background. This is unusual in being a decorative piece. And it's clearly something which has been curated and kept. It's getting on for, it's at least 150 years old when it was thrown into the cellar. Other things amongst this early group, these are really exciting. These are what are called Batavian wares. This is a style of teaware that was popular in the sort of late 17th, early 18th century. Then it's revived later, so you get a revival of it. The brown exterior is instead of having a white, it's a white porcelain, but with a brown clay slip dipped onto the outside of it to give this brown exterior to contrast against the blue and white, quite often painted internally. In this case, a little flower on the bottom of the two cups, smaller cups. The wide cups got more detailed decoration on it. These both have what are called shop marks on the bottom, which clearly indicate that they're from that Kangxi period. The exciting thing about them is most obvious on the most broken one in the foreground there, which is this sort of Rococo, I don't mean that, I mean Baroque, don't know, yeah, on the outside here. This, unfortunately, has suffered in the ground. One in the background has enamel on it as well, but this is enamel decoration painted in London around about 1710, and these are normally considered as kind of artworks. They're your V&A type object. They're very rare. They think that the one workshop in London produced them briefly, and there are references to a Dutchman being kicked out of London who's been he's been chased off by other craftsmen who don't want him in town, and it's likely to be him. So these are quite the cups themselves are not that rare, but to have the London enamel ones is quite remarkable. They're not usually found in archaeology at all, this sort of thing. So this actually suggests that some of these objects are things which somebody is not, they're not coming to Wells, somebody is going to London to buy these things. They really are luxuries. They're really quite, they must be special objects at the time, not just now. So they're really quite exciting. Yeah. And then these are the dinner plates we saw on the table at the beginning. Very typical early 18th century Chinese dinner plate types. It's a Western silver form. These are beautifully made. They're very slim. Although the designs, you've got two of one design, one of another, nonetheless, the plates themselves are precisely matching. So we're looking probably at a set of plates with 3 different floral designs on. So for the sake of argument, 6 plates, 2 of each pattern, but as a set of 6, with this very beautiful blue-black inky style, which is also typical of the earlier things. In China in the 17th century, there are a lot of wars and rebellions and things. Things get very complicated. And it's in the sort of 1660s, 70s, 80s, they begin to start to try and rebuild the export market they'd had earlier. And when the East India Company are first going to the Far East in the sort of 1700, 1710 period, they're tending to buy the things that Chinese are making for them. They're not dictating what's made. The Chinese are trying to make things that they think we would like. So the decoration on this sort of china tends to reflect a lot of these flowers and objects relate to symbolic meanings in Buddhism or in Chinese culture. The perforated rock in the center of the middle is a reference to kind of popular Chinese gardening styles. They're very different from the sort of export china that we commonly see from the later periods, which is much more geared to contemporary Georgian taste. These are, if you like, these come as found as the exotic, as opposed to us dictating what they are. So they're particularly lovely, these. I really like them. The other exciting early thing is this little group of sherds here, and in fact, now we've gone through the collection in more detail, we've probably got a couple more of these. These are called capuchines, and you've got a couple there from Rathfarnham Castle in Dublin, where there's an interesting hole full of broken pot of a very similar kind, but dating from about 1720, which produced those two. Ours is very, very similar. They're basically perhaps a chocolate cup or a coffee cup, and they're an idiosyncratic shape that appears at that sort of date in the early 1700s and then goes out of fashion and doesn't reappear. It looks a very contemporary shape, and it's often characterized by this double band at the lower handle join, and on some European versions of the shape that's a raised line. But again, they're quite uncommon things. They tend to be seen as being kind of quite individual objects. So to sort of sum up on those early pieces, they're relatively unusual objects. They're not unique, and with the exception of the teacup, the Batavian cups, they're not necessarily incredibly rare, but they will be special things that will be expensive. So we're talking about someone with some cash who can perhaps go to London and buy things rather than a trickle down process coming to Wells via Bristol and Bath, which is the way things would work at the next stage. When we get on to the mid 18th century, what we have is lots and lots of cups and saucers, often in sets. The group at the bottom here, the cups and saucers there, they're all matching. There are parts of 3 or 4 sets of cups and saucers, often with slop bowls, the larger bowls, going with them, probably used for other things as well as slops, but they're distinctly oversized. Mostly plain, simple shapes. Some of them are ribbed, the ribbed ones up there, and with very typically patterns which are either the kind of floral combinations with a peony in the middle, or the river scenes with a pagoda in the background somewhere, and begin to look vaguely familiar if one's thinking of kind of things like willow pattern. There has been quite an academic debate about how you date things like this, and there's quite a bit of thinking now that kind of makes a link between the way in which the East India Company buyers go in saying, we want 1,000 of those, 2,000 of those, 3,000 of these, and we want a pavilion here. We want that. They're dictating the pattern quite a lot. And if you look at a ship like the Geldermalsen, the Dutch East India ship, which was wrecked in 1745, and whose cargo was famously brought up by divers and sold for vast sums of money in Amsterdam a few years ago. They had very, very limited range of patterns, all looking rather similar in this sort of genre. But it's mainly about tea. There are only 3 or 4 dinner plates in this group. The key thing is drinking tea primarily, and it's interesting that there is a lack of other associated objects. So, with the exception of the tea service, I'll come to, there are no teapots, no jugs, no tea caddies, or any of the other associated things. And it's interesting to look at other archaeology where there are tavern groups from Cambridge and other places where you've got large amounts of teaware like this clearly being used as the kind of the commercial china for a coffee house or a tavern that's doing hot drinks and food as well as beer and ale and gin. So they're quite utilitarian objects. They're kind of luxurious, but at the same time they're ordinary. There are some nice saucer dishes. These are bigger than saucers, too big for a cup, so they're meant for presenting food on, but they're not plate size. They're sort of side plate size things. And you do see some very nice ones with individual figure groups and so on. These are relatively coarse ones, but they're rather fun. Sort of mid-century. These are some of the dinner plates, a pair of simple floral ones and one with a river scene. And there are a few other variations. Clearly, there is a pair there, but what's not coming, I think there are 3 of those altogether, but they're not getting a sense of sets, but not in the context of this particular part of the group anyway. But these are, they're quite sort of commonplace objects. The exotic thing, or at least it's not exotic, but the exciting thing that comes with this lot is the tea set. There are, I think, at least 4 cups and saucers. There is a splendid saucer dish at the top there, and the squashed remains of the teapots, the only teapot from the whole collection, at the bottom, part of a small slop bowl on the left. In the centre, a very nice lid, which will be a lid for a sugar basin, but there isn't. The bowl isn't the sugar basin because the diameters don't fit. It's the wrong shape. So there must be another bowl somewhere. And there isn't a jug or a tea caddy, but right up in the top right, there's half a lid. And that lid is not the teapot lid. So therefore, there should be a tea caddy or a jug somewhere. And very often jugs had lids at this period. And these are all enamelled Chinese porcelain with figure scenes on. These were very popular in the sort of 1770s, much imitated. So you'll see examples in sort of Lowestoft porcelain or Chelsea porcelain. These would be, the majority of porcelain in China is being made in Jingtianzhen, and then shipped down to Canton for sale to the various European merchants. The exception is with the enamelled wares, the decorated wares like these, Anglaise enamel on, where the decorating was being done in Canton. So white porcelain was being bought by the enamellers, and then they would paint to order for the European or American buyers. And it's interesting with this set that looking at it closely, you realise that some of the pots, the teapot, the lid, and I think one or two of the other pieces are made from one kind of porcelain, which is a very bluey green colour, and the other pieces are all made from a different one that's a yellowish tone. So you can see somebody buying in different varieties of white china produced them. Lovely fine work on them. All the enamel decoration has suffered rather from being buried on all of the enamel pieces, so these things aren't as bright and wonderful as they would have been when they were new. The exciting thing is, well, no, it's all exciting. The exciting thing that comes out was when is this painting. The chap's name's gone out of my head. This happens. Leotard, right? From about 1780. He's a Swiss painter who specialised in still lives and very much like doing portraits of pottery and china and tea sets. And in amongst his paintings in the Getty collection is this lovely tea tray. It's about to go off for the washing up. People have had tea and they've had their bread and butter, and the dirty cups and spoons have gone in the slop bowl, and everything's ready to be taken off back to the kitchen. And it's not only is it delightfully explain how the objects are used, and what the set should look like as a whole. But if we kind of look back and forth at the figures on the dish up there, but most particularly the border patterns and detail, it's all exactly the same. It's particularly evident really on the serving plate in the middle. It's also nice to see how the serving plate is used to present bread and butter as something you have alongside your tea. The black tea in the background. We've also got the tea caddy in the jug to indicate where the lid belongs. This one's this is a set of 6, yes. And you've got the basin and the sugar basin. This sugar basin has no lid, but we have to keep looking through our sherds, and see the detail of the border pattern, particularly there on the dish in the middle, and then the border of ours there. Ours is entirely in black, with some green on the other one, but it's splendid to see it actually in use. Right, that's the middle range. The third group are the later 18th century things. These come in sets. This is just two of the sets. The top one with the plunging cormorant, and the bottom one with the very exotic sort of rather Victorian-looking plant stand with something very exotic growing up on top of it. I don't know what it's meant to be, pineapples or something like that. What happens from the middle of the 18th century is that the Europeans, and particularly from the Chinese point of view, the British, start to make their own porcelain, but also to make large quantities of refined earthenware, what we might call creamware, pearlware, Wedgwood and the others, Spode, Turners, great batch, building the technical skills, but also, if you like, defining what the fashions are, and they're undercutting the prices of the imported pottery. It's tricky for the East India Company because the margins on porcelain are in the very low percentage figures, and so they start to put pressure on the Chinese makers to economize on the cost of production. So things like extra detail, a lot of early ceramics, early porcelain has lots of decoration on the back as well as the front. That all disappears. Shapes become standardized. A lot of these shapes are press molded. The big dishes are press molded rather they're not thrown and modified. The plates will be thrown and then pressed over a mold and trimmed. And decoration becomes very standardized. The thing you can see, I think, particularly on the lower set there, is the way that some of that looks very familiar. That rim and border looks very, very familiar. It's not exactly the willow pattern border we associate with the china in the kitchen, but it's pretty close. And there's an exchange now going on where the buyers are going out holding a couple of Wedgwood plates or a Spode printed plate saying, this is what the market wants. It costs this in England. What price can you do with them for? And you find examples where they have quite literally taken printed borders or even printed designs in the middle of plates and hand painted them to copy them. And so these things are becoming cheaper and cheaper. And by 1791, I think it is, the East India Company decide that porcelain's just not worth the bother anymore. And they stop buying it. They buy tea, they will ship it. If you, the merchant, want some Chinese porcelain and you send an order, they'll get it for you. But they're no longer interested in the trade. So the whole business of the auction on the dockside disappears and it becomes a private matter. The other thing that goes badly wrong for the point of view of the East India Company is the American War of Independence, because a lot of their trade, there's a trade to London, but by that time there's also a trade to the Americas, and they're controlling that trade. And after 1776, the Americans are sending their own ships around Cape Horn to go to China and get their own porcelain, or they're shipping it in through the West Coast. And you get a diversion of style, actually, at that point, where you find that the export porcelain to the American market becomes different and more influenced by European China. But the thing that survives, I suppose, is often the kind of the decorator and the exotic. If people are going and doing their own importation, they start to pick up on the kind of the specials rather than the tableware, and the production of tableware becomes something which is something which we're doing much more ourselves. So, as a kind of last example, what I didn't do, just to kind of go with that. Dinner. We're talking about services and sets of things, and eating. One of the things that I mean, there's a big issue with how this china all got in the hole, and we'll come to that. But there's also what it's for. We've got, as I say, very little decorative material. What we've got is a lot of tableware and a lot of teaware. Teaware, relatively straightforward to see how it's being used. But when it comes to the table, 18th century cooking, 18th century eating habits are, rather different from what we do today. And these vessel shapes and objects are very much geared to those sorts of activities. So we've got straightforwardly plates for eating from, but as I was saying earlier, we've also got large numbers of these serving dishes. These particular ones, typical kind of octagonal or sub-octagonal rectangular things. But sets would also include oval shapes, triangular shapes, tureens. There are quite a lot of things that are missing from what's in the cellar, and will be used for quite elaborate table settings. So these diagrams are from a book called The London Art of Cookery by John Farley in the 1780s. There are lots of other examples of these sorts of things, and this is part of a book which suggests recipes, but also table settings for the year. So this is the bill of fare for July for a 2-course dinner. And they go on and on. Yeah, there are 12 sets, and then it's all the recipes, and some of the food is rather peculiar, but and it can be slightly difficult sometimes to visualize these as a meal. But the principle is that you use all your ashets and larger vessels, saucer dishes, elaborate shapes to lay out a range of dishes on the table, and then the dinner plates go around the outside of that with the cutlery and the glasses, and then in order to take part in the meal, you're then choosing from the range of things there. So it's like a Riestaffel or a barbecue or something. I don't know. These are two courses, or removes, they're sometimes called, and you've got we got the rump of beef or tongue in the middle of the first one. The rump of beef is à la braisée, so presumably braised. You've got a green pea soup and another soup at either end. You've got mutton and lamb on the outposts, and then garden beans, a fricassee, a veal, and some things that are upside down around the outside. That would be raided by everybody till it had enough of it. It would then be cleared, removed, and the second lot would be wheeled in. This has a cherry pie and a savoury cake in the middle, so there's some signs of pudding, but on the other hand, it also got a roast turkey, venison, sturgeon, ducks, mushrooms, French beans, and ragu. So the idea of a dessert or a pudding stage is not. They're there if you want the sweet things, but there's all sorts of other stuff as well. So there's a big demand for all these large vessels, so large pots, if you like, or large plates to serve things on. And specialised shapes are very much part of this, the sort of latter or mid-later part of the 18th century porcelain. I just threw in the picture on the left. There is one of the things you might expect to see as the 18th century progresses would be English porcelain taking over the role of the Chinese porcelain. You might expect to see that, but what we've found so far is that there is very little English porcelain, with the exception of a small group of maybe 10 or 20 pieces of Worcester porcelain, most of which are just the kind of slop bowl, large bowl forms, but includes this lovely, 4 parts of a 7-part sweetmeat set, which would sit somewhere amongst one of these table settings, and you imagine a range of different chutneys or pickles or whatever. The little 6-sided vessel in the middle, and then 6 of these little triangular ones. They're about maybe 12 centimetres deep, each hand painted. Rather nicely, they've got the individual painter's marks on the back, and 2 of them are painted by the same person, and the other 2 by 2 other people. But really rather nice to have so much of it. As I said, there are still boxes of potsherds to plough through trying to find the other pieces of that. But that again goes with this way of eating. The other rather lovely thing that's in amongst those is the custard cup on the other side, on the right hand side. These are sometimes described as sugar basins. And in this case, it is a single piece, but they do come in sets. It should have 2 handles. One's disappeared, the other one remains. So it's a lidded covered vessel. And the knob, which would be a piece of fruit sitting on the top of it, is missing. It's quite large. And it's an embossed design on the outside. The pattern is known as the squirrel and grape pattern, blue painted vine with bunches of grapes on it, onto which an enameller has added more coloured grapes and then squirrels climbing about in the vine to steal the grapes, which is rather nice. But it's quite fun looking at the 18th century cookery books for detail on things like that. There are lots of wonderful recipes for custards and things, and imagine people with a big spoon dipping into these things for some kind of delicious thing, probably with lots of booze in it, because all of these things will be accompanied by hearty helpings of port and Madeira and whatever. So the plates we're looking at are part of that sort of that culture of eating. It's a fairly large house. And certainly the people living in the house are well off. So this kind of way of eating would be normal. The later tea set is which was on the table with those plates, is interesting because it's entirely in keeping with, if you like, Staffordshire pottery of the day. You'd find cups like these being made in English porcelain, but also quite commonly in earthenwares. Very much European handled cups as opposed to tea bowls. The jug, unfortunately, we only have fragments of, but would be a rather weird looking square thing with a big spade spout, which is the piece on the top left, called a helmet form, and does look like a fireman's helmet inverted, but matching these. There are also a few teacups that match as well. It's interesting with Chinese porcelain. Early on, the East India Company were very unkeen on handles. So the popularity of tea bowls is partly dictated by the fact that Chinese don't make tea bowls with handles, but also by the fact that the East India Company objected to them because you could get thousands of tea bowls inside each other into a packing case, but as soon as you put handles on them, you reduce the number of vessels you could ship by half. So sets like this cost more because of that. They're more expensive. In this case, their colour of ink, the decoration on them is broadly consistent, but they are kind of eccentric and not particularly well made. But again, it's interesting to see the way the patterns would start to resemble the familiar willow pattern there. They kind of predate it, but you've got the essential, that the large pavilion on the middle one and the small pavilion in the background, which manages to look like some character from Batman, and then the boat with a couple of people fishing in the bottom, which later on you evolve into the bridge and the whole mystery of the willow pattern. Yeah, this is the interesting thing about these tea sets is the constant lack of teapots, and that strikes me as peculiar. The missing things are something. It's very easy when you look at a pile of archaeology to forget that part of the evidence is what's not there as well as what's there. The one other group of decorative objects come from this late period. These are probably towards 1800. They're 3 of 5. This is what's called a garniture de cheminée, or a mantelpiece ornament. You have a set of 3 lidded, it's very standardized. You have a set of 3 lidded vases in this sort of baluster shape, and then 2 tubular ones with a flared neck, which sit between them to form a decoration on your mantelpiece. In this case, 3 of them have survived with a fair proportion of their sherds, and the other 2 are in the more shrapnel state. Brightly decorated, sort of blue and white base, and then very eroded figure groups on 2 sides of them, and little bits of detailing and so on. What the photograph doesn't indicate is how small they are. If you go to Chatsworth, you'll see this sort of thing. They popular right from the early 18th century onwards, but you'll see this sort of thing in a big country house, and they're kind of 50, 60 centimetres high. They're massive things. These are maybe 15 centimetres high. They're tiny for a very small, polite drawing room. They're at the same time they're quite kind of personal, aren't they? They're not. They're somebody has chosen those as decorative items. There's something quite exciting in a way about. Although one has to be careful about the idea that these objects have come out of this particular house. That perhaps these represent the very particular individual taste of somebody selecting something to decorate one of the rooms in that particular building, maybe that's it. That's potentially very over-romantic. They're not great pots, but they're interesting. And they represent the end of the group. Although theoretically it's all found its way into the ground around about 1820, there are no objects we can find so far that can be shown to date after 1800. So whatever's going on, there's a kind of gap between them ceasing to be accumulated, if you like, and they're being thrown away. Just keeping an eye on my time. How are we doing? Yeah. Okay. That leads to the documentary side. How have they got there? What are they doing there? Egg Cathedral Green was owned by the Dean and Chapter of the cathedral and leased out. Unfortunately, not all the leases have successfully found. Teresa Hall has spent a lot of time looking at this documentary side of things, and it's been tricky to find all of the leases for the period. We know that in the late 17th century through to 1716, William Hughes, who was the Chancellor of the diocese, lived there. The early porcelain would fit very nicely with his dates and probably be the right sort of he's the right sort of chap to own that sort of stuff. But his will, he effectively says that he's not a person who's into material culture and objects and stuff, and he wants all his stuff disposed of and sold so that his monies can be distributed rather than bits and pieces. So it's unlikely that stuff was left behind in the house at that point. There's a bit of a gap then, but until 1760, when the lease is bought by somebody called Peter Davis, who's the registrar of Wells and a lawyer. He, in 77, bequeaths the lease to his second cousin, Peter Shurston, who would appear to have lived in the house up to around 1800. So far, so good. There is a possibility that, despite what William Hughes specified, that objects are being left in the house. New tenant comes in, there's stuff in the cupboards, never mind, carry on living in the house, use the stuff in the cupboard. And then the next person leaves, they leave their collection of bits. It's gradually accumulating in the house. That's one way of looking at it. But in 1807, the lease is sold to Edward Spencer. He's a surgeon, or he trains as a surgeon, and he was the mayor of Wells twice in the early part of the 19th century, master of the corporation. Seems to have had all sorts of business interests. At one stage, local apothecary went out of business, and he bought the business and started to trade as an apothecary. He's later listed as a general dealer or chapman, which implies he's buying and selling almost anything. He seems to have been in the property trade, and latterly he invested in calamine mining in zinc in the Mendips. For that purpose, in 1814, he mortgaged the lease for £2,000 for 1 year. That wasn't a good idea. And in October, later in the year, he was declared bankrupt due to what was described as an unfortunate speculation. And the lease was put up for sale. It seems his brother Arthur did at least attempt to argue in some way that the contents of the house were not part of the bankruptcy and to try and rescue the contents, but that was unsuccessful. The lease was then bought by Joseph Lovell, who seems soon after that to have laid into the house with a sledgehammer and builders and produced the house that we see today. So you have this event, 1716, 1720, where Spencer is leaving the house but appears to be unable to get the contents out of it, followed by Lovell bringing the builders in. And then we have a lot of broken pottery out the back on the building site. So it looks a bit as if what's happened is that Lovell has taken a pretty brutal approach to the contents of the house. It's hard then to establish whether, where to go with that, because you've got 120 odd years of pottery, different types and styles. Very hard to decide whether exactly what's going on, whether Spencer's activities as a general dealer have acquired stock to sell. Is it a junk shop? Is he a hoarder? He had other properties. If during his bankruptcy did he sell properties and bring all his other belongings into this house in order to sort of compress his belongings. Does this represent, in that sense, several arms of his family's belongings over 100 years? Very difficult to be sure. The other detail that comes out as one's looking at the objects is that although people have barrowed an enormous lot of stuff into that cellar, there is only one teapot. There are no bits of other than some Worcester. There is very little English porcelain. Where's it gone? Or was it ever there? The glassware that there is all early. There's no later stuff. So has somebody taken all these things away? Has it been partly disposed of, partly kept, partly not? Probably that's the case. The absences are interesting. That's where we are, really. That's an overview of it. A little footnote, which Teresa found in 18... I know the dates are wrong there, aren't they? Anyway, something wrong with my figures. 1854-57. Troth Jenkins was the widow of the Reverend Richard Jenkins, who was the Dean of Wells. And her will, she lived at number 8, and her will, this is obviously after all this has happened, refers to her very valuable dinner service of old coloured china and an old china dessert service bought by myself. Also a blue service of old nankin and china in the drawing rooms and on the staircase. In other words, she collected porcelain. Nankin is the old-fashioned word, or the period word, used to refer to blue and white export porcelain, quite specifically. Her old coloured china could potentially be English, but Nankin is quite specific. There's just a little nice little oddity that in the 1850s, there was somebody there who collected porcelain, but no connection, obviously, but just a little added bit. So I think that's where we are at the moment. We've got lots more to do. We've produced I'll show you in a moment, but we're in the process of getting all the writing up done on all the other pottery, which other people are studying, to produce a full archaeological report. There are great plans for an exhibition in the museum, and we're going on researching and prodding this stuff to find out more about it. At the moment, just trying to see whether in amongst this we've got any Japanese porcelain, which would be quite a nice thing to find if we can. So I will wind up there and hand back to Lizzie. That's my marvellous cormorant. I love him. And just to point out to people that we have produced a booklet for the museum on the collection, which is £5 from the museum shop, or get in touch with them to obtain a copy. And it summarises what I've been saying, and also Teresa's work on the documentary side, which has more detail about some of the individuals like Spencer and Lovell, who are both interesting local characters in their own right. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Ollie.
Okay.
And that really did sort of raise quite a lot of questions, actually. And don't forget, if you're watching, don't forget you can put questions into the chat button, and Ollie is still here to be able to answer those.
We'll try and answer.
Oh, don't know. I'm sure that there's lot. I wrote a lot in here, so I've got plenty to ask because I really enjoyed that. A question here: is there a lot of evidence for the repair or early repair of Chinese porcelain?
Yes, there is. The double gourd vase is exciting because the gluing of that is apparently really quite early. So that may have been broken before 1700 and repaired. But there are quite a number of pieces amongst the rest of the porcelain which have been riveted. Mostly the earlier things. There's a very large saucer dish which has had the rim knocked off and put back. And there's a little lotus flower shaped cup. It's a tiny little thing, which is one of the pieces we're busy debating whether it's Japanese or not, which has had a little chunk taken out of it, and somebody has very laboriously riveted it back together again. So again, it's a tiny object. It's quite small.
And are these riveted? Are they? Did you say?
The corrosion has done horrors with the rivets, but they're riveted with some kind of copper alloy. Drilled through and then
okay. Have you got any idea of what was used for the glue?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
When Richard the Conservative found that, he immediately backed off because he didn't want to interfere with it, because he did feel obviously it was an important part of the object.
Yeah.
And the pot itself had been glued together in the 1990s with yew, which he would normally remove, but he said, if I do that, I'll spoil the... It's probably something like rabbit skin glue, I would imagine.
Seems to work fairly effectively, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What did they use to make the blue colour?
Cobalt. Initially in China, they come across cobalt on Middle Eastern ceramics, which they're fascinated by.
Right.
And they buy blue glass from the Middle East and crush that.
And that sort of smalt or something?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And you can recognise that sometimes because it's glass, it bleeds and you get a rather soft colour.
Yes.
Latterly, they then begin to discover sources of cobalt in China that they can quarry and mine themselves.
I was going to say, where do they get the cobalt from?
Is Western China at that point, not Germany, which is Germany and Zambia are the other place on there. But they find their own sources.
I was very struck by the quality of the painting on the pots. I mean, it's really very beautifully done, isn't it? I think they must have trained for yonks to be able to paint as well as that.
The finest quality stuff is quite beautiful and very refined and very precise. So is the clay work. It varies enormously, though. There are some really chunky, heavy, clumsy objects around in amongst it. But even some of the kind of, if you like, the bulk produced cups and saucers. I've got one on the. I can weigh this about, but I've got one of the cups and saucers here. I don't know if you can see just how thin that is.
Yeah.
And the cup with it. This is the matching cup. I mean, it's even thinner. It's delicate. And
that's all thrown on wheels.
Quality of painting on that is it's good. It's nice. It's all thrown. Some stuff, a lot of stuff is thrown, and when you get the things like the octagonal shapes or the ribbed shapes, they've got a mould, and they'll throw the pot, push it down over the mould,
and then that'll give it extra wobbles,
to shape it, and then take it back off again. So
but I mean, that must be huge amounts of skill throwing porcelain as thin as that. It's pretty wobbly sort of clay, isn't it?
They would be thrown and turned. So it would be two craftspeople. So one person would be throwing them, and they would be thicker, and then somebody else is machining them down. If you it's not particularly evident on these, but on some Chinese porcelain, you can see the turning tool marks. Sorry, and you can see turning tool marks coming all the way down to the rim.
All the way down.
So they've got it on a lump of clay, and they're machining it down. And you'll find sometimes the edges are incredibly thin, and you think, it must be a delicate pot. You pick it up, it turns out to be quite heavy. Because it's all about what the rim looks, because you judge the thing from the rim, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. But good and solid on the bottom.
Yes. Bigger plates are often like that.
Yes. Well, they're harder to turn, aren't they, really? Yes. So a question here, were there design variations to meet specific tastes and cultures of different export destinations, i.e. different countries within Europe? So did the Germans like different things from the French, I suppose?
They're certainly very acutely aware of different markets. The Chinese potters have been exporting to the Middle East for a long time before they really started exporting to the West. So they're quite accustomed to the idea of making things for markets.
Yes.
Certainly the late export stuff to the Americas is different from the stuff that's coming to Europe before 1776. There's a distinct change of taste. I'd be bluffing if I said I was entirely aware of a difference between perhaps Dutch taste or German taste, but they would the ships that are going into buying Canton their buyers are buying what their customers want. So the answer would be that yes, there's a mediator there between the Europeans and the Chinese.
But these sort of ceramic pots, they are very sophisticated for a very sort of sophisticated market, aren't they? What were ordinary people eating off at that time?
Well, if one's thinking just the range of pots that are in this group, I mean, you've got a lot of pressed molded, slip decorated dishes, which are undoubtedly being used for food consumption as well as food serving and so on. But you've also, of course, you've got the Delftwares, which, whilst they might be relatively luxurious in the 17th century, they're not in the 18th century. They're cheap and cheerful. And so there's a huge market for that sort of thing at the cheaper end, often copying the Chinese things quite closely. In some cases in quite a lot of detail, but again, a huge variety of quality.
So given the popularity, was willow pattern regarded as somehow lower in status compared to more individual designs? Or was it?
Well, willow emerges in the late 18th century when the British potters are getting really interested in printing.
I was going to
say worked out how to do the various forms of transfer printing. These, well, that's not a good example, but the sort of stock Chinese, it's not very easy to see that, is it? But the stock sort of pattern the East India Company liked had a large pavilion, a willow tree, a river, and an island with a small pavilion on it. It's a very standardized scheme. And essentially, the Chinese are making a lot of versions of this. The lowest off porcelain makers, the blue and white makers in Stoke-on-Trent are producing versions of this. When they get to printing, they start to make printed versions of that type of design, and you get a whole range of variations, of which the willow pattern is just one of those prints. There's another one called Broseley, which was very popular at the time, which fizzled out. And willow's the one that catches the imagination. So, and initially, as new technology, the printed wares would be expensive. But because it's quick and easy to produce, it goes down very, very quickly. And
they've presumably got better at doing it as well.
And lots of manufacturers copy it. Even the print side of things, people set up businesses doing the printing for them. A whole subculture of people, or subculture, I think there's more of that probably going on than people originally kind of have realised looking back at the history. But so everybody has their own willow pattern. I mean, there's everybody
has their sort of variation on the theme.
But there are a number of patterns like that, like Asiatic pheasants, with the two pheasants in the middle of the plate, which were just became quite sort of universal popular patterns in the 19th century.
Just have the right sort of appeal.
The cheap china,
Well, it must have been a really good project to really. I bet you've really enjoyed working on the.
It's very exciting to. I mean, it's enjoyable to learning about them anyway. But piecing it together, putting it, making sense of it, the whole. It's always lovely handling pots, finding out about them and finding out about people. The whole business of people's lives in the 18th century is embedded in this. The whole and there's this business of how Wales relates to the outside world. China comes to Wales. I mean, I didn't really say very much about that, but the East India Company bringing the stuff over, it being redistributed by the buyers in London. The main trade is through Bath and Bristol. The two annual fairs in Bristol, Londoners would come down, take over a pub, fill it with stock. You imagine the shopkeepers from Wells going up to Bristol to load a cart up with whatever they could get up there to bring down to Wells. The more ordinary stuff here will have come that pack horse route.
Presumably in baskets, all stuffed with straw and things.
Oh yes, and on the ships in some cases full of tea, or sago was popular apparently as a packing material.
Good Lord. Get to eat it afterwards.
Well, it's better than polystyrene, isn't it?
At least it's biodegradable. Somebody would like to know, how was your project funded?
How was it funded? It's part of an Arts Council funded group of projects which are to do with renewing, re-exhibiting and remodeling Wells and Mendip Museum. There will be more projects ongoing, but
excellent.
Redoing
so how would people? Sorry, I was going to say, how would people find out about the projects that are going on? Will they get in touch with Wells Museum?
Get in touch with the museum, yes. I know there are new projects coming up, and there are all sorts of education projects and events and things being worked out with those. There's a very, I mean, the projects are very much driven by the idea that this is about the people of Wells, rather than about the academic niceties of these pots. Clearly, the academic niceties are important. And there are some really, quite exciting things that
it's always nice to sort of relate academia to the real world, isn't it? Yes. After all, it does spring from there initially. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've done some lovely things on storytelling and so on at Wells. I'd love to see some stuff on food and on 18th century cooking, but maybe also about contemporary Chinese cooking. Take it round that way.
Yes. Well, there we are. Perhaps they'll be listening to us and maybe get some ideas.
Yeah.
I think we better finish there, Ollie. I could talk to you for ages. I really enjoyed that very much indeed. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
I hope we do another one sometime. That'll be good fun.
Lovely.
Okay.
Well, thanks for having me.
A pleasure. Okay, so in the future we have some more webinars coming up from SANHS. On the 12th of January, David Dawson will be talking about Landscape with Chapels webinar on the chapels of Somerset. And on the 26th of January, David Victor will be talking about Preston Bowyer Manors. And our associated societies are also been very busy, and they've got who's this one now? We've got the Mendip Museum on the 2nd of December, have a lecture about Broken Angels, a scandal at Glastonbury Abbey. And that's by Mark Hutchinson. On the 7th of December at Queen's College in Taunton, a lecture on what makes a British hero. And on the 14th of December at Tintinhull Village Hall, a genealogical detective story by Clive Barker. So plenty of things to keep you occupied on the run up to Christmas. Details of any webinars or any live events, of course, on the SANHS website. And of course, if you'd like to donate to SANHS for tonight's wonderful performance by Ollie, please do go to the SANHS website and go to the donations page. That only leaves me to thank everybody. Thank Ollie for his excellent talk and the brilliant webinar team that you never see, Nathanael, Tony, Allan and Emma. And thank you all for coming along. And hopefully we'll see you all again sometime soon. Okay then, thank you and goodbye.